Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Hickman. I am the founder and CEO of Urban Ashes, and you're going to hear a lot of things very much connected to what Daria just spoke about. I got involved with what I used to say, and still kind of do say, urban salvage wood in the mid-late 90s as the retail sales manager for a company called EcoTimber, for those who may remember EcoTimber, based out of the Bay Area and San Francisco. That was my introduction to utilization of street trees. The first one I ever personally used was a camphor tree, and obviously not native to this country. And shortly thereafter, I moved back to the Midwest. I'm originally from Indiana. I believe there was another Indiana panelist up here earlier. Go IU. Moved back to Michigan, though. I went to Ann Arbor, another Big Ten school. And shortly thereafter, I moved there in 2001. And as probably most of you know now, 2002 is when Michigan acknowledged that the emerald ash borer was first identified in Canton, Michigan, which is 18 miles pretty much due east of Ann Arbor, and about 44 miles southeast of Grand Rapids, to give you kind of proximity, how quickly it spread. Early on in the emerald ash borer situation, the group of us got together, and I was part of a organization, was on a board for a group called the Environmental House. And because I was really the only one at that point that had any experience with urban wood utilization, everybody's looking at me as the guru, and like, I've only done this for a couple years. So that's a little terrifying. But we put together, there's original 4 of us, we put together a network of mills. We started the original Urban Wood Project. You'll see another one under that name out of Baltimore now that came about 10 years later. But we launched the Urban Wood Project in Southeast Michigan. And with those mills, we're selling lumber at a local retail store, grew to about 4 other locations across Southeast Michigan from about 2005 to 2009. And then in 2009 or so, launched Urban Ashes as a manufacturer of picture frames and furniture, as Scott said, and we grew to sell to about 250 retail locations in 43 states. But I started to really realize our impact as a picture frame company. Even though we grew to a pretty good size, we were selling toothpicks and diverting toothpicks, and the volume of urban wood out there is ridiculous. It's, for those who don't know, there's roughly about 46 million metric tons of furniture grade urban lumber available every year in the United States that ends up either being chipped or turned into firewood or biofuel. So that's a pretty substantial volume. As far as carbon goes, as Scott said, carbon is a very big thing. Most of you probably know that wood is on average about 50% carbon by weight. And so cut that in half, you're down to about 23 million metric tons of carbon released every year that we could capture if we actually utilize it. So what I want to talk about here is several have already said, in Michigan, we had no idea this was coming. Obviously, we knew it was a pretty nasty pest initially, but it probably took 2 or 3 years in the state for them to really realize the magnitude, or the kind of like COVID, but COVID was a little faster, that how bad it is. And once we actually started to engage in it, most of the trees were really in bad shape already. And so what I want to show here in the next few minutes I have available is to compare the difference of what Michigan's gone through and what Oregon is just starting to embark on, and what potential Oregon has because other cities and other states around the country have already been through this. So I'm going to run through some quick numbers here. Michigan, they lost roughly hundreds of millions of ash trees, 200 million or so on the conservative side, 20% of them at 24 inches or greater in diameter. That equates to about 15 billion board feet lost, or 11.2 million metric tons of carbon lost. That's what Michigan's lost in the last 20 years. Most of it was lost in the first 10 years. 41.2 billion metric tons of CO2 emitted, and roughly 680 million tree saplings. This one is what always amazes me. That's the equivalent of planting 680 million tree saplings and grown for 10 years. So that's how much carbon was lost. If you were to try to make up for it in tree planting, that's how many you'd have to plant. That's a pretty substantial. In 2005, 2 years post the first EIB, there was we were processing roughly 200,000 board feet of urban salvage wood, or 150 metric tons. Not a lot. We were just getting started. In 2019, The state, we estimate that we're processing about 263 million board feet is available of furniture grade lumber, and we are or 400,000 metric tons of carbon available to be sequestered. Of that, we're actually only doing about 2 million board feet at this current time, or 3,000 metric tons of carbon sequestered. Now jump forward, and that's how the equivalent of the saplings that we're planting now from processing. Currently, we're only capturing 1.12% of what's available in Michigan. It's still a small percentage. So really in the last 5-10 years, things have ramped up quite a bit in Michigan, but also around the country. So we're projected in 2028, 26 years after the first EIB identification, to be up at about 10% of the available hardwood, urban hardwood, or 26 million board feet processed and 40,000 metric tons of carbon sequestered. And that's the equivalent of planting 2.45 million trees. So what I want to point out here is the utilization is something that can be put in partnership with planting. And you have this correlation here to offset that. And cities start to realize that when they're losing 600 trees and planting 1,000 trees a year. And then when you do the math and they realize it's going to take them 15 to 20 years of planting 1,000 trees to make up for year one of lost. So we got to come up with other ways of capturing that carbon lost. Now bringing in Oregon. I got 1 minute left, so I got to do Oregon fast here. You guys are just starting, so not too bad. Your estimated processing currently of urban wood is about 850,000 board feet, or 1,272 metric tons of carbon being sequestered. This is all urban salvage wood being processed. And in comparison against Michigan side by side, you'll see, so they're still behind Michigan quite a bit. Obviously, there's a lot less hardwood here than in Michigan, but you can still see the volume is well behind Michigan. However, when you project to 2028, if we start now aggressively, as we are in Michigan at the moment, I think we can hit 34% of what's available by the same time in 2028 of 20 million board feet processed and 40,000 metric tons. So my point here is that we're at a point to really start building the infrastructure now. Don't wait.